the numbers of LGBTIQ+, as I said, are completely overrepresented in the homeless sector. So the statistics that we often quote, because they vary from country to country, is 20 to 40% of youth homelessness. So 20 to 40% of youth homelessness identify as LGBTIQ+. And the reason for that is quite simple, and it's not rocket science. It nearly always happens at the point of which a young person comes out to their parents, to their guardians, to their siblings or their family. And in that moment, if they are rejected by their family, if they don't accept their lifestyle choice or whatever phrases that might be used, that young person it's almost an inevitability that they become homeless. If you lose your parents, your support network, that pillar in your life that's supposed to be a motivator for a young person and a safety net, if you lose that, it's almost an inevitability to becoming homeless. So if you put yourself into the position of a young person, if you are rejected by your family, that probably means you have to move home. And that creates a lot of difficulties. So if you no longer have a postal address, for example, you may no longer be eligible to even access social benefits. You may not be able to access education or employment opportunities or training courses if you don't have a postal address. If you are forced to leave your family home, you may have to move to another commune or a district or area of a city. And when you do that, not only do you perhaps lose access to your friends and your supporters, but you may have to leave your education or your current work because you can't commute or it's not in proximity to you anymore. When you may have to drop out of education because perhaps your family were supporting you in education. And then, it has these long-term triggers for vulnerable LGBT youth, because if you are forced to leave education, you have a lower educational attainment. You may have wonderful skills, but you may not have them on paper or the qualifications that an employer might want. And in that instance, you then may have to take lower paid employment opportunities. And so you see all these different elements come together on top of the discrimination for the fact that they are LGBTIQ+. I think that intersectionality is very important when we talk about how do LGBTIQ+ youth access housing and homeless services. And the biggest problem that we encounter is this thing called institutional erasure. And that is whereby a service provider isn't collecting any data or information about a young person, or any person for that matter's, sexual identity when they come through their services. And that has a very long-term impact. And it's almost like this vicious cycle. So if you imagine the young person comes to the service, they aren't asked, are you gay, are you lesbian, are you trans? And we're not saying they have to ask that question the second they walk in the door. There's obviously a process and it has to be done in a sensitive way. But this information isn't collected. So if you ask a service provider to say what percentage of the people that you work with are trans, they can't tell you. But what they probably will tell you is, we don't work with them because they don't come to our services. This isn't a problem for us. And it's purely because they don't have that data. And because they don't have that data, they then decide that, well, we don't need services for the LGBTIQ+ community because they don't come to us. So then their services aren't structured. They are sometimes what we call male-orientated services, which are services that have been traditionally developed for men in their 30s or their 40s. And the needs of this profile of people is very, very different to the needs of a young person who is struggling with their sexual or gender identity. And that becomes a huge problem, because when that young person comes to the service, they don't feel safe. They don't feel empowered to talk about their situation. They feel stigma, perhaps, for the fact that they are homeless. And they feel further stigmatized and marginalized because they can't talk about their sexual identity. LGBTIQ+ homelessness is invisible, and the way that I try to categorize or to conceptualize the invisibility is almost over across three different areas. The first is the homeless service providers, which I've just mentioned, and how that basically relates to service providers don't collect information or data on the young people, therefore they don't think they exist. The young person doesn't feel safe there, therefore they no longer come back to the services. So as far as the service provider is concerned, they're invisible. The second then is around the LGBTIQ plus community more broadly speaking, because I guess it comes back to it depends on the context that the countries you're talking about, but in general, homelessness isn't on the agenda. When you think of LGBT rights, you don't think of the right to housing. You think more broadly around marriage equality, adoption, trans identity, and those issues are of course incredibly important. But there's almost this prioritization, and we don't think about the situation of homelessness or housing, because, and again, it goes back to the fact that it's hidden. The third level of invisibility is more broadly speaking across society, and I think that's for a number of reasons. Because if you think of homelessness, you don't think of LGBTIQ plus people. You don't. If you see a homeless person on the street, they're not going to be wrapped in a pride flag. There's going to be nothing about them that you're going to think, oh, okay, well, that's a trans, or that's a lesbian, or that's a gay person. There's nothing to signal to that person that this person identifies as LGBTIQ plus. There are a number of things that service providers should be doing to support the needs of LGBTIQ plus. And I think the first and most important, and probably the simplest, is to put up a pride flag, put up a poster, put up something in your organization that signals to a young person who walks through that door that they are welcomed, that this is a space where they can feel empowered, where they can feel safe, and that they can talk about the problems that they have experienced. And the second thing I would say that all service providers should do is to collect data. It's very difficult to talk about this issue when the data that we have is so scarce. We have wonderful information from the Albert Kennedy Trust in the UK, from Le Refuge across France, from the True Colours Foundation in the US. They are wonderful allies and excellent services that support LGBTIQ plus youth, but they are in the minority. They are not mainstream, and they are not replicated across Europe. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think the final action that I would recommend to any LGBTIQ plus service and to any homeless service is to get in touch with the other. At the moment, we have this huge vacuum that exists, and that if we don't have these organizations speaking to each other, sharing information, understanding what their roles are, then this vacuum will only broaden, and more young people will be left marginalized, will be left homeless, and will be left put aside. And it's nothing groundbreaking, but it can be a very simple engagement for a homeless service provider to work with an LGBTIQ plus service provider to understand, okay, here's how I should ask these questions, or here is a counsellor from the LGBT network that can support homeless youth who are coming through our services.